It's Sue Stockdale again, and welcome to the podcast. You know, inspiration is like a magical gift that's within all of us. It's free energy that we can give to others when we share our experiences, our insights, and what we've learned about life. Our aim is that you get inspiration through conversation. Whether I'm talking to a neuroscientist or a non-profit leader, their stories have the power to shape, strengthen, and challenge your views and values. We hope each episode ignites new possibilities within you, makes you think, and maybe even take new action as a result. We've now published almost 50 episodes and want to measure the impact they've had on you. So let us know. There's a link in the show notes to do this either via the survey or leave us a voice note. On to today's episode. I'm speaking to Dr Nashater Deu Solheim about how to take care of the relationships that are important to us, be it as a leader, in social circles, or within families. I had watched her TED Talk titled, What Working with Psychopaths Taught Me About Leadership, and that got me curious to find out more. Nashater explains the subtleties that we need to be aware of before and during a conversation to demonstrate empathy, curiosity, and an interest in the other person, to build that all-important trust and connection, something that she had to do when working with psychopaths. I love the quote that Nashater uses, leaders don't have to have an answer for everything, it's not a requirement, when she talks about why leaders sometimes avoid difficult conversations, especially when they're discussing something more than just a work task. I hope you will enjoy it too and be curious to learn more. Welcome to the podcast, Nashater.
Thank you so much, Sue. I'm delighted to join you. Thank you for having me.
You've got so much knowledge about human behaviour that I'm fascinated to learn more about. What got you interested in understanding human behaviour in the first place?
You know, I love this question. I have been asked it before, and it's one of those questions I wish I had a wonderfully succinct and fascinating answer to. I don't know if this is fascinating, but I do come from a very large family. You know, we're 7 children and very, very different personalities, and I'm kind of 6 in the hierarchy towards the bottom. So I think it does go back probably to growing up in a large family.
And where did then that interest take you in terms of your career path?
I studied psychology at university in Liverpool as a bachelor level. And it was during those studies I discovered actually there's a way in which you can use psychology in a very practical and clinical fashion to help other people. That really attracted my attention. There was also a module that really caught my attention on forensic psychology. And so it was then really I decided to go in and train as a clinical psychologist. Once I'd finished my bachelor's, I went on to my doctoral program and wanted to learn how to apply this in practice to help other people.
So you've given us a nice segue into even more interesting part of your career around working with psychopaths, which is always something I'm sure that people are intrigued to find out more about. How did you end up doing that?
When I was doing my clinical training, I did a specialist placement in forensic at a special hospital, they're called in the UK, which is essentially a maximum security hospital, which is housing people who have committed offences, usually very, very violent and are considered very dangerous individuals. Hence, they need maximum security environment, you know, high walls, barbed wire, locked doors, and intensive supervision. But they're called hospitals because they also present with a mental disorder or mental illness. And I just fell in love with the whole way of using psychology to understand what brings people into these experiences. What are their stories? What are their journeys? How can we, as individual psychologists, but also as a society, perhaps even begin to think about preventing people from having these experiences where we can, so that they don't end up committing these terrible crimes and going on to creating the harm that they do, both to others and to themselves. I then decided, once I'd left my clinical training, to go and work in one of those hospitals, which I did for several years, really looking at the role of mental disorder in offending, and also the role of psychology and personality. And a subgroup of those people are classified as psychopaths, if I'm correct about that. And they are really the extreme end of that personality spectrum.
So I'm imagining that it also requires you to be doing a bit of adaptation, going into work in that type of extreme environment, Nashater. How did you prepare yourself for doing that effectively?
We had very intensive and expert training during my training. And the core of that really was about ensuring that you were aware of yourself as much as you were involved in looking at other people and assessing them and understanding them. You had to work on yourself. We had our own supervision. We had our own therapeutic experiences to make sure that we were able to understand what it really means to put other people through the processes we've taken them through. And part of that training really was about how to handle high secure environments in my forensic training. And some of the things that I did that you now see actually me talking about in other settings in my book are how you prepare yourself, preparation being the biggest part of that process. How do you prepare yourself before you walk into a room with somebody who has the propensity for violence, that you may trigger something inadvertently or quite inadvertently, that you would understand who they are, do your homework, do your research, find out how they are presenting today, how they're feeling, how they feel about seeing you. And you would also be very conscious about figuring out as much as you can about their interests and their drivers and their motivations, so that when you go in and you speak to them, and in this environment, they were locked up and they had no power really. You carry all the power, you're wearing keys that open and close doors, and they're very much in a restricted environment. So important for you to understand those dynamics and how to bring out the best in the conversation that you need to have so that you can get the information you need. I was very well prepared. That was part of the training. We were trained very much in understanding how to communicate non-verbally through body language, where to sit, how to use our body language to communicate openness and collaboration, where to sit in the room so that we were safe and able to exit if there was a risk of violence or harm to ourselves. And then really we were trained in the art of conversation. That was the third part.
Many of our listeners may be leaders in organizations and hold power, and other listeners may be having on the way up the career ladder and be often going into conversations when they're speaking to somebody who holds more power than they do. What are the things that are particularly relevant from your experience that they ought to be thinking of?
It's a great reflection, and actually is exactly the reason I went into both working the way I do now with leadership and coaching, but also is now captured in the book. I really reflected when I became a leader myself. I moved from that forensic environment I've just mentioned, moved into working with the Ministry of Defence and working with active military. And then I moved into working in business as a leader myself, and then as a coach for other leaders. And when I arrived in that business environment, it was in my own experience of leadership that I started to draw on the training that I'd had, even more so. And I wasn't expecting it to be as relevant outside of those environments that I had been trained to use them in. So when I find myself in a business environment as a leader and drawing on, oh yes, it's very helpful to know the person that you're speaking to, the more research you do on what is their motivation for coming into this conversation with you, what are they interested in, what can be this win-win that we can create, so that although I'm asking for support or I have an agenda, that I'm also able to meet their needs and make sure that they come away with value from the conversation. And thinking about my body language, thinking about what questions shall I ask? How shall I open this conversation? I was doing all of that. And the more I did it, the more I started to find myself sharing that in my coaching practice inside business at the time. And people responding with, oh, that's helpful. We hadn't thought about it that way, in such a systematic way. And it came from that when I observed other leaders then, when I began coaching further, that wasn't necessarily always. Some people certainly did it. So by no stretch of the imagination am I saying that I never experienced that. I certainly did. There were some great leaders who, I think without even realizing it, were doing those things, really preparing well, really conscious of how they were communicating non-verbally and verbally. But there were certainly many leaders I had experienced myself, my own leaders, but others I was coaching who didn't have that insight or experience or understanding. And when I shared it with them, it was an aha moment. They're like, oh, if you do that in that way that you describe, what a difference it makes to the collaborative feel of a conversation. What a difference it makes to how willing somebody is to go the extra mile. Oh, I hadn't thought about not just racing in with my agenda and putting it on the table and demanding that it happen as the leader, because I can, I've got power and mandate. So to your question, yes, it really does help when you use these psychological techniques and practices to create a more collaborative environment, which isn't about showing up with power. It's about showing up as a willing partner in the conversation. At least that's what I think is very effective in leadership.
Well, I must just let our listener know that you did role model your practice in preparing for our conversations, Nashater, which is always very refreshing for me to experience that when engaging with a guest. So I do commend you for actually role modeling what you talk about with others.
Well, thank you, Sue, because it's something now that has become so inherent in the way that I work. I've been conscious of it when I'm using it for specific reasons, but in these kinds of situations, I'm so curious about what it is that we're going to do, and I want it to be such a good experience for us both. I guess it's become really my everyday practice. Thank you for sharing that.
You mentioned the word neurodiverse a moment or two ago in what you're talking about, Nashater.
Right.
And I know that research shows these days that 1 in 7 people in the workplace are likely to be neurodiverse. thinking about leaders, recognizing that maybe a number of the people that they work with or they themselves are neurodiverse, how should they be mindful and able to adapt to different types of people that may engage with them?
What a wonderful way to describe our, differences when we use this phrase neurodiverse. And I like to use it in its broadest sense. I know it refers actually to a specific spectrum of people or people with differences, but I actually use it in its widest sense that we are all neurodiverse. Every single one of us is slightly different to another person. And so I think it's so important for leaders to see their team as diverse in itself and to recognize the individual differences within the team, albeit that this team has in common a goal, a way of working, tasks, focus areas, but they are individually different. And that diversity, if we are able to use that in such a way that we maximize or exploit in a positive way that diversity towards the common goal, I think that's when you get high performing teams. It's when we ignore those differences and we try to get people to move towards this common goal in spite of those differences that we see a loss of productivity or drag, as I call it, where you're not recognizing that somebody in this team needs a different way of communicating with you. They need a different way of being explained to. They need another way of understanding this same task than the person next to them. I think that's when we see a lot of drag. So celebrate the diversity of a team, really learn the individuals in your team, and then use that towards a common goal. I have a phrase, so I'll just share it here, where I say, for leaders who don't know their team members beyond the tasks, don't really know their team at all. And that's a real pity because there is so much you can learn and then utilize together by learning each other better and deeper.
So it makes me think about the tentative natures that leaders sometimes have, or reluctance or anxiety to perhaps go beyond what might be seen as work tasks. I've certainly come across many leaders in conversations I've had where they say, oh, I don't want to talk about private stuff with my team. That's personal. I don't want to go there. And yet I'm hearing you talk about them needing to get to know a person better, get to know them more deeply in order to demonstrate empathy and get the best from that person and for it to be a collaborative conversation. What would you suggest leaders do, or anyone for that matter, to be brave enough to go into those areas that they may perceive are uncomfortable?
That's something I also recognize is a challenge for many leaders who believe that really the reason somebody is at work is to do a task. And that if we just focus on that, whether the task is done or not, then that's what's most important. But what we miss then, what these leaders are missing there is that we are very complex human beings, not to overstate the obvious, but we are affected by our emotions, our thoughts, our experiences, and our feelings. And so when somebody's showing up at work and not delivering at their full potential or capacity, as you would expect or you've known them to do before, would you not be curious as a leader to figure out what that's about? And that might well be something that's happening for them in their health, or it might be in their personal situation or relationship at home or with their children, or, something as simple as driving into work, they may have had a near miss or an accident. If we don't take the time to see people in all their dimensions, to understand what's impacting their motivation and drivers at work, we lose the opportunity to build the trust. And it's really about trust, building that trusting relationship where somebody feels comfortable coming up to you and saying, the reason I'm not at my best today is because of this. But so that you understand, and with that goodwill and that trust between you, they will be able to get back on track much more quickly with your support. If you have no idea what's going on in somebody's life and you keep battling at them to deliver harder, to deliver faster, deliver more, and you have no idea what's holding them back, you will breach that trust and you will eventually lose them and certainly lose their goodwill before that. So it's critical, I think, for leaders to see that they are leading people, not task delivering machines, and in understanding and using that emotional intelligence, that toolkit that they have to understand what's driving this person, what brings the best out in them, but what might also affect them in terms of not being able to give their best. It's so important. It's actually a non-negotiable, I think, in leadership.
What you're making me think about, Nashater, is they need to see their people as human beings, not just human doings.
Oh, I love that. Yes, Sue. I do like that, yes. If all we needed were tasks done, well, that's where we're seeing a lot of automation coming in. And that's where AI, automation, digitalization, these huge digital transformations taking place in organizations where tasks are getting replaced from using people to do them to automating, is where the person doesn't need to be in focus to get the task done. I can't see that there is an environment. I actually say this very boldly in my book. I don't see that there is a business environment where a person is not required somewhere in the business. And where a person is required, we need to understand that they come with interests and experiences and motivations and drivers, and we need to pay attention to those.
That's so important. And one of the ways to do that, and I think we've used the word already in our conversation, is to demonstrate empathy. And I know people often confuse empathy with agreement to somebody else's point of view. How can anybody learn to demonstrate empathy whilst also not necessarily agreeing with somebody else's viewpoint?
You'll have heard people talking about leaders need to show empathy and they need to be vulnerable and they need to be authentic. And there's a lot of these words being thrown around that are around leaders needing to get out of their own heads, as I call it, and be much more into the experience of the other person. And empathy for me is key in that, because empathy is about understanding the other person's perspective. Now, to understand doesn't mean to agree. I've been a clinical psychologist for many years. I've had patients coming into my clinics who have had very different experiences to those that I have had. And nevertheless, I've needed to help them and support them to move from those into a different way of being, a healthy way of being, or to recovery. And I've had to empathize, meaning I've had to try and put myself in their shoes and try to understand from their experience what they're going through so that I can help them. That doesn't mean that I have to have had the same experiences. I couldn't possibly. Nor that I have to agree that what they're going through, I need to agree with it, that you are feeling terrified and scared. I understand that in your situation, given your experiences, you feel terrified and scared of doing what it is. Do I need to agree that that's the only way to be? No, I don't need to agree with that. I want to help you to move from that to a different way of being. So actually, I'm more interested in taking that experience, validating it, showing empathy. Yes, I understand where you're coming from and I recognize how that's come about. And let's look at how we can move forward. Very different to sympathy, which is, I think it often gets confused, where for me, sympathy would be much more about aligning yourself with the other person's feeling, agreeing with the other person's feeling. If you feel terrible, oh, now I feel terrible too, and how awful for you, and staying really with that emotional agreement. Whereas empathy, and particularly in the business environment, is about understanding another person's perspective, seeing how they have come to that decision or way of thinking, and thinking about how we can move on from that towards whatever goal it is. How can leaders show it? Curiosity. Curiosity for me is the antidote to a lack of empathy. If you're struggling to understand somebody else's perspective, get into curious mind, listen very actively, and ask very open questions. Silence actually can be very helpful, I think, in empathy. Often we feel that the best way to show empathy is to keep talking. But listening silently and allowing the other person to speak, and then see if that curiosity opens up a different perspective for you.
The conversation continues in a few seconds after this. If you are a busy person and probably always feeling behind, then you may be wondering how you can get more done in less time. One solution is working with a virtual assistant. They can help with social media, graphic design, customer service, copywriting, digital marketing, and many more tasks. iWorker is a social enterprise that connects you to talented remote workers from countries in crisis. Most of their team come from Venezuela, a country facing dire economic circumstances. By hiring from iWorker, like we do, you'll get back some time for yourself and help to change a life. Find out more by listening to episode 20, where I spoke to co-founder John Miles. Or you can look at their website, iworker.co, to find out more. Now back to the podcast. And I'm curious now, Nashater, just from what you said there, I'm imagining that idea of asking a question and not knowing what is likely to come back is what often stops somebody asking the question in the first place. What, in your experience, helps somebody to keep going and not just to close down and not go there?
For leaders who are uncomfortable with other people's emotions, I think, that may also be something that they struggle with in their personal lives. We are human in leadership, and a lot of what we bring to leadership is what we are like in other parts of our lives. So if a friend came to you, or a child outside of your work environment came to you with some kind of emotional share, how would you show up for that person? What would you do? Now, it's not that that's directly transferable in its entirety. You may give that person a hug in your social life. You may open a bottle of wine and sit down and talk it through. Oh, no, that's not what I'm recommending you do at work. But the point is that you would be drawing on your empathic skills if you are good at it or you are open to it. So you would listen, you would reflect back what you're hearing, you would give empathic responses like, oh, that sounds like that's very tough. How are you going to move forward from that? What help do you need? How can I support you? Those phrases that you would use are not dissimilar to what would be helpful to do in the work environment. That said, if you are uncomfortable generally when people show emotions and you try to avoid opening up, that's something I really think is part of your personal development as a leader, and you need to both reflect on and also get help with. But here's something you can do in the moment. The reason we get uncomfortable is because we often feel that we have to fix things or have answers. And leaders do not need to have the answers to everything. It's not a requirement. Often what we're looking for is leaders to become good coaches and to help the other person who's sharing find their own answers. So rather than taking on the sadness, taking on and engaging and getting into the emotion the other person is showing, you can simply listen and ask questions so you can help the other person find their own answers. So, for example, I encourage leaders to give empathic responses which just reflect back what they're seeing. So if somebody's in tears and saying, this is really difficult, you can just reflect that back, both in your nonverbal language, which is very powerful, by the way, so you're far more powerful than what you're going to say, by showing through facial expressions and body language that you care, that you're paying attention, that you're listening. You're not on your phone while they're doing that. You're not tapping into your PC. You're not scribbling notes. You look them in the eye and you pay attention and you show open body language to say, I'm here and I'm listening. And then you come back with, that what you've just shared there about, the difficulties you're having with your partner or with your colleague sounds very stressful. That simple validation can take you a long way. You don't need to get engaged and find the answers. You can then ask a follow-up question. So what have you thought about doing? What kind of support have you sought? Well, whose advice have you looked into? What can I do to help you? That can help leaders who are a bit uncomfortable to stay in the space of working on it together than taking it on and feeling they've got to run away and find the right answers and solve this situation themselves.
That sounds like really an important distinction between actually what the role of a leader is. As you say, isn't to have all the answers, perhaps to ask the right questions.
And I do find that a lot of leaders who struggle in their leadership role are doing one of two things. They are either deciding for themselves that that's the role they're going to take. So they run around fixing things even when they're not asked to. And that's seen as micromanagement or interfering by their employees. Or they feel that they have to have all the answers and they feel overwhelmed when they don't. And it can make them feel this thing called imposter syndrome. I'm supposed to be the one that knows everything, has all the answers, and I don't. And that makes me feel inadequate and incompetent. And I don't feel I can lead this team because I don't know enough. Neither of those is required in leadership. What's required is the ability to have a very clear direction of where this team or this organization needs to go, to be able to communicate that clearly and not to have all the answers, but to work collaboratively with your team to find those answers towards that direction that you are very clear about. That really is at the heart of good leadership, I believe.
Well, I would certainly agree with you on that one, Nashater. And what do you think makes it difficult to decouple our emotions from our behavior so that any of us don't avoid those tricky conversations when we are potentially overwhelmed with emotions or feelings of uncertainty? How can we be better at doing that?
There's a neuroscience to that, which I won't go into deep here. And there's a lot of good literature on why we are so quick to emotion and what's happening in our brains and with our hormones and our physiological responses. Some of you will have heard of flight and fight when we're in a threatening situation, even if it's not the bus coming towards us, but it's a conflict conversation. That same part of our system is triggered, this need to either get into the argument or run away and get away from it. There's a lot going on there physiologically, which means that we are responding very quickly in a knee-jerk way without pausing for thought and reflection before we respond. And so how can we decouple it is exactly that, is to introduce a pause between the feeling and the urge I'm getting to jump into conflict or to run away from it, for example, to pause and reflect and give due time to consider what is it that's being triggered in me? Why am I feeling the way I'm feeling? What are the thoughts going around in my head? How can I create a reflective space? And that might mean discussing it with somebody else to just get some clarification, to get a different perspective, to think through your options before you go into action. So it is that physiological tendency we have that is driving the emotions to give us knee-jerk reactions in our behavior, but we can interrupt that flow. And it does take practice and it won't come easily, and it'll come more easily to some than others, to be able to create that pause. And I often use a traffic light system with leaders when I'm working with them and say, when you feel that urge coming to jump in and criticize or to speak or to solve or to fix, just sit for a moment, buy yourself some time and think through, what are my options here? And why am I wanting to react the way I am? And is that the right response to have?
I'm imagining this set of traffic lights in my mind now. What do the red, amber and green stand for?
Well, the red is obvious. Just stop in your tracks. Don't say it. Don't write it. Don't press send on the email. Don't shout it. Don't fix it. Just stop. Yep. Just stop for a moment. And whether that's stop for literally a moment, or you've got the time, for example, to buy yourself some time, you might encourage leaders to, rather than answer the mail straight away, just send a mail saying, let me think on that and get back to you tomorrow. Serve it up as a pause so the other person knows why you're going to take some time. Don't just go quiet. Nobody likes radio silence when they put out a request. So just let them know you're going to need some time and then go away and do that. So stop, create a space, either in the moment or longer if you have the option, and communicate that you're doing that. Then the amber is really your research time. Go and figure out, what is it that I can do here? What are my options, either on your own or using a sparring partner or coach or a colleague in your environment? This is what I'm thinking. What might be my biases here? They're making me wanting to do this, take this particular course of action. What other options do I have? What would you do, etc.? And then green is, okay, once I've done that evaluation of what my options are, then I can go in and I am in a calmer state of mind now because I've decoupled the emotion. So by the time I go into responding, I'm not responding from an emotional, defensive or knee-jerk place, and actually having the other person in mind place. Because I've thought through what's not just right for me, but what's right for you. What are you needing in this situation? And so when I respond, when I go green, I'm taking care of what you also need in this conversation or this ask.
That's a really easy way to remember it, the traffic light idea. So I'm going to hold that in my mind for future, Nashater.
Absolutely.
We began our conversation today with you talking about an interest as a young girl in human behaviour and that driving your career path. If we look at it from a few years on down in your career and all of the experiences that you've gained to date, what are the insights that you now have about humans and how they behave?
Oh gosh, that's an enormous question, Sue, isn't it? Fascinating question, and I probably could spend a whole day or longer answering that. A couple of insights, I think, that have more recently dawned on me through, when you're writing a book, you reflect on exactly that. What are all the lessons, experiences that I've had, and how do they make sense for me now, and how do I use them now? And so a couple of things I would share. One is that when we talk about diversity, it only gets us so far. Humans, when they work together, yes, we are diverse, but at some point we also have a lot in common. And that there is an important element when we're working together with other people, whether it's in relationships, I'm talking intimate relationships, partners together, or in business as teams and leaders and teams or colleagues, that at some point what we have in common needs to be as important as what makes us different. Because it's what we have in common that helps us to work collaboratively and move forward and together, as much as it is what I can bring versus what you can bring. So that was one thing that I reflected on, that we need to talk more about our commonalities as much as we do our differences. The second reflection I had was the importance of focusing on the other person's interests. It's a real revelation to me when I did my negotiation training, how much we can solve in conflict, in disagreement, in those kind of difficult conversations when we have the other person's interests and drivers and motivations in focus, rather than just battling on with what we need, what I need, what's in my head, what's my agenda. My insight was our knee-jerk is to think about ourselves first. I have this idea in my head, so I'm going to share it. I have this thought, I need to speak it. I have this need, I need to fulfill it. Even with the best intentions, collaborative intentions, you tend to have a focus on your own agenda. So that if we can pay more attention at the start to the interests of the other person, we can get so much further in a more collaborative, happier way, essentially. So those would be my two insights, I think.
Really important insights there, Nashater. Are those contained within your book that you've been mentioning so far?
They are. They absolutely are. And perhaps, I'd want to highlight that I did a TEDx talk on what I learned from working with psychopaths and what that taught me about leadership. And in there, I make a point about the importance of being authentic. We need to be our true selves and show up as our true selves, but the importance of being authentic with empathy. And we've talked a lot about empathy today, Sue. That's the reason I wanted to mention that was it created quite a bit of debate, that TED talk, and that because of the idea that we encourage people to be authentic, show up as your true selves. But when your true authentic self means that it comes at the cost of the other person. Perhaps you like to be brutally honest where other people don't appreciate that approach. Or you tend to be very dogmatic and controlling and people in your environment don't appreciate that approach. Then being authentic but having empathy towards how other people like to be treated is so important, particularly in a work environment. Because if you live in a vacuum, sure, you can be authentic and you can be your true self and never have to filter what you say or do. But when we are working collaboratively with other people, being authentic but showing up with empathy is the difference between engaging other people and disengaging.
Well, I think you've brought the reminder to me that it's not just about the me, it's about the we. And even outside of business, if the way we look at society is to be cognizant of the effect we're having on other people when we're being authentic, is how I'm interpreting what you're saying.
Exactly. We're talking about business leadership, but absolutely, if we think about our families, if we think about our social circles, we are together with other people. And if you want those relationships to thrive and to be sustainable, then taking care of them is important, right? We would all say that where we have relationships that are important to us. We want to take care of them. Well, taking care of our relationships means showing empathy and understanding other people's needs aside from our own. So that's really at the heart of all relationships.
I've learned so much from you today, Nashater, and really the word empathy is going to stick in my mind. And it really does put a spotlight and a reminder, hopefully for our listener, about what Access to Inspiration is all about. It's about helping to highlight the commonalities as opposed to the differences between all of us as human beings. So it's really been wonderful to speak to you today. How can people find out more about the work that you do and the book that you have?
So thank you so much. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation and highly inspired by your journey and story, actually. So I'm thrilled to have been able to join you today. So the best way would be to either find me on Progressing Minds, which is my business website, or on LinkedIn. I am very active on LinkedIn. My book is also available through Amazon. So if you key in my name or the Leadership Pin Code, which is the title of the book, then you can easily find my details there. So please reach out. I'm pretty good at getting back to people personally, so I'll be very happy to connect with anybody who's interested.
Well, that's great. And then we will put all the details on the show notes and make it easy for our listener to be able to find out where you are located on social media, Nashater. Thank you again for your wonderful insights today about human behaviour. It's been great to speak to you.
Oh, my pleasure, Sue, and great to speak to you too. Enjoy the rest of your day.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Nashater. What did it make you think about? And how are you going to turn those reflections into action? That's the thought I leave you with today. Remember, you'll find transcriptions for all of the episodes and some playlists on our website, accesstoinspiration.org. You can keep in touch with us on social media, on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. Just search for Access to Inspiration. So remember to take our survey or leave us a voice note and give us your thoughts on the impact that this podcast has on you. You'll find details on the show notes. Next time, it's our 50th episode, and I'm going to be in the hot seat. Rather than being hosting, I'll be the guest, reflecting on what I've learned during the last 50 episodes. I hope you can join us then.